You are listening to episode 53 of In Film We Trust. I'm Liam.
I'm Wayne.
A weekly podcast where we discuss, dissect, and deep dive all things film, from the obscure to the mainstream.
And now, on with the show.
Buckle up, gore hounds, super freaks, and trashy aficionados. In Film We Trust is heading to the drive-in for a peek into the world of the godfather of gore, Herschell Gordon Lewis, and his 1964 splatter classic, 2000 Maniacs. The nudie cutie, the roughy, splatter cinema, hicksploitation. Lewis has been there for it all, and even wrote the whole goddamn proverbial book on it.
So earlier today, I was watching quite an interesting film. It's a movie from the 60s, quite graphic. It's called Blood Feast. Have you heard of it by any chance?
It's a possibility. It's a possibility. The godfather of gore himself, Herschell Gordon Lewis.
The man.
Now, I know this is your second viewing of a Herschell Gordon Lewis film.
Yeah.
Your first, 2000 Maniacs. Now, I really want to know your opinion because, as we've said, these were one of the films I used to find out on the internet when I was in my teenage years and like the gore whore I was. Give me something bloody. Give me something gruesome.
The forbidden films you're not meant to watch.
Films. Now, first viewing for you, what's your opinion?
Of the man himself? The man himself, he was certainly an ambitious man, and he was certainly good at making the most with what he had, because he worked on usually very paltry budgets on the periphery of the film industry.
Yes.
I think that gave him a lot more power, because I don't think he felt bound by studio pressure, studio interference. He could just kind of make the films he wanted to. But I'm actually going to have to offer a correction here. This was actually my third viewing of Herschell Gordon Lewis film.
What was the first?
Sort of.
Goldilocks and the Three Bears?
No, no, you mean the Three Bears?
Yes.
Man, I was going to bring that up. I love that title. How good is that pun of a title?
Was it not that one?
No, it wasn't that one. It was one maybe you don't expect because it's not one you think of when you think of Gordon Lewis.
Okay.
He was involved in the production of a film. He needed another movie because he was doing a double feature. In our Grindhouse episode, we talked about famous double features back then. And he took a film from a guy called Bill Rebane. It was called Monster A Go-Go. He became the uncredited director. He had a kind of a role in that. I know it wasn't necessarily his baby. He added a few scenes to it, jiggled it about a bit, and then he released it. One of the worst films I've ever seen.
I know, it's gone down this history as well. I think he was a Wisconsin filmmaker, Bill Rebane.
Yes.
Because I'm sure there's an Arrow box set and it's called Weird Wisconsin, the films of Bill Rebane.
Right.
Which is tempting to buy. I was so tempted to buy, Wayne.
Just because it's got an odd name.
I think so. Because there was also a box set from Arrow Player about William Griffey.
Yeah.
I've already got, as I've mentioned, I've got the Herschell Gordon Lewis box set. I was tempted by the other two, but I couldn't pull the trigger.
No.
Have you seen Monster A Go-Go then?
I have seen Monster A Go-Go.
And
Monster A Go-Go
is
look,
it terrible, as they say?
Yeah. Look, there's lots of films I've seen in my life where I'll be like, I didn't like that, I wouldn't watch it again. There's few that I actively hate.
You actively hate
things
Monster
like
A Go-Go?
Monster A Go-Go, The Creeping Terror, something like maybe Manos, The Hands of Fate, the more famous ones. Monster A Go-Go is bad because it's basically just a waste of time.
I'm detecting a little pattern here.
Yeah.
Films you hate and you can't stand, do they also happen to be horror films?
No, not all of them, no. I think, is it because horror is such an extensive genre?
I think so.
Because I would argue no movie genre has more subgenres than horror, and how they do often blend into each other. But I think it's because horror is seen as being a kind of cheap genre.
It can be an entryway into the film business, and anybody can have a go without necessarily having talent.
They're generally low-risk, kind of higher-reward films, especially nowadays. It's rare that you hear a big horror film bombing because it costs nothing to make and it turns a big profit. I think a lot of people maybe get their start in that, but these were just very bad examples of the genre. I don't hate the genre innately at all. They were just very bad examples of the genre.
Can I seek the gore whores on you?
Yes, you can.
Right, but I made reference there in a joke, Wayne. Mm-hmm. Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Bares. No, that wasn't off the cuff. This was actually a film by Herschell Gordon Lewis.
It was.
Right, in the 1950s, there was these films. They come to prominence. This was pre-pornography, before it got big, and there were naturist films.
Yes.
They would go into naturist camps. It would be naked people playing tennis, doing something very innocently. Mm-hmm. But Herschell Gordon Lewis was one of the first to devise a story for them. Mm-hmm. Now, we were on about Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but I digress for a moment because this is his more famous nudie cutie, as they became known to. These naturist films were kind of became a narrative, had a story to tell. And he made one in cahoots with producer David Friedman, The Adventures of Lucky Pierre. And now this film, it's a film about a man who finds himself in situations where all women are nude, essentially first to give a narrative around a nudie cutie. And you're thinking, okay, this is niche, this is stupid, this is silly. Wayne, this film was a financial success. Grossing over $12,000 in a single theater over a week's run upon opening.
Do you think it was essentially the premise that got people into it? Because we're talking the 50s, you've talked about these nudist films that were set in nudist camps. Obviously, the Hays Code is still in effect. You mentioned nudie cuties there, which is a subgenre of sexploitation, full of female nudity, but it was linked to naturalism, like you say. Right. And interestingly, they were actually, these kind of films, these nudism films, they were exempt from banning by the Supreme Court because it was considered lifestyle. It wasn't considered sexploitation. And a lot of sexploitation filmmakers in the 60s claimed their sex films were documentaries, because that was another way of getting around these bans.
Well, was that not another weird niche thing? They would have like pregnancy videos.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, getting a bit creepy on this end now.
Yeah, it's just these weird little things they used to get around it, because the Hays Code didn't really come out of fashion until like kind of the 60s. So you're still working in this area where Gordon Lewis has actually said this himself. He said when he was making these films surrounding these taboo subjects, he said, most of the walls have crumbled, most of the inhibitions have disappeared. One generation ago, it was hard to insert a four-letter word into a script. Nudity was reserved for special pictures only. One generation later, we say, so what? We see the bar crumble as we move it higher. So that's kind of his big contribution to this, how
he's crumbling the bar.
Exactly. He made these films with these taboo subjects that made you realise they shouldn't be taboo. And that, when you were talking about The Adventures of Lucky Pierre, do you know what the pitch was for it? Gordon Lewis and Friedman were given $7,000 and they were told to make a, quote, colour film of cute girls carousing around with beach balls or whatever.
There's a premise.
They knew this was going to make money, I think, because it's controversial. Again, you wanted to watch these kind of movies on the internet.
Hey, I'm talking about the horror films.
The horror films, of course,
yes.
Yeah. You want to watch these because you're kind of not supposed to. It feels cheeky. It's like something forbidden. Yeah. That's how you make someone seek something out. You forbid it.
Now, on a side note, how desperate were men then?
Really?
To see some flesh on screen.
Exactly. They would do anything. They would these nudist camps, which not even that inherently sexualized, but because...
No, it wasn't really allowed to be sexualized.
No.
That's what we're saying. Lifestyle, educational, quote unquote.
Yeah. So obviously they weren't shown in mainstream theatres, but maybe they'd have bigger success when they were shown. I don't know, maybe they were released on video, whatever. When we spoke about video nasties, everyone had to get hold of these VHS tapes covertly. Like they don't have to take them out of the video rental shop in a brown bag.
Oh, no. Oh, I think that's maybe the later on years, Wayne, when it became something else.
I think so.
But in film, we often talk about partnerships. Now, integral to Herschell Gordon Lewis's success is David Friedman, who we just mentioned. Herschell Gordon Lewis, if you want to say, is the talent.
Yeah.
David Friedman, the producer.
Yeah.
Now, they needed one another. Now, this came into fruition because Herschell Gordon Lewis was doing commercial work for companies. He was shooting advertisements, for example. Now, he realized to compete with California, he was based out of Chicago initially, Herschell Gordon Lewis. So what he did, he bought a 35mm camera, and he said to somebody, look, how do I actually make money off this 35mm camera? And somebody said to him, look, shoot features. You have to shoot features. Now, we're talking in the age of the drive-in cinema, where they were requesting cinemas of 70 to 80 minutes. You know, something relatively short, has to be cheap. It doesn't necessarily have to be a status of a Gone with the Wind. They weren't aspiring to that. Now, he found his important relationship with Friedman, because Friedman, at the time, David Friedman, his name was the gentleman's peddler of smut.
Okay then.
Right, but Friedman was also the head of promotion at Paramount at the time.
Okay.
Funnily enough, now in Friedman, Herschell Gordon Lewis had found his P.T. Barnum, somebody who would promote his work, somebody who could push his work, advertise his work. Herschell Gordon Lewis himself also came from a background of advertisement. So within themselves and between themselves, they had found something that they knew that would make a profit.
And I don't want people to think that these were just these directors, these filmmakers, this is all they ever did their entire lives. There's 2 films which were made in the 60s, 2 sexploitation films. One was called The Bellboy and the Playgirls. The other one was called Tonight for Sure. Do you know who was involved in writing and directing those films? It was Francis Ford Coppola.
Really?
Exactly. So it's not just these niche, they're quite niche subjects, but it's not just certain filmmakers that make them. Again, we talk about getting a start in horror. Did Brian De Palma not do, was it Greetings?
Greetings, Hi Mum. He done all them. They were good films.
So you start off with these early films, which are not really reflective of the later work.
And we've got to say, and I'm going to big this up because I think it's Roger Ebert's best ever work. He wrote the script for Beyond the Valley of the Dolls.
The Valley of the Dollars.
The Russ Meyer film.
Do you really like that?
I love that film.
Is that a film you're considering for a future episode, you think?
Yes. Now you've maybe give somebody else the idea away.
It deserves the idea. Can I just go back to quickly? I just want to move on because I think this is hilarious. Back to the Adventures of Lucky Pierre.
Have you? I think you want to see this film.
I do. Do you know what makes me really want to see it?
What?
The poster.
Yeah.
The poster, that Goldilocks and the Three Bears you were saying before, those posters are hilarious.
Yep.
They are very tongue-in-cheek, kind of like the movies are. Because I want to say, here are 2 quotes that are come from the poster of The Adventures of Lucky Pierre. One is, millions spent for actors, setting and story, not a penny for costumes. Even better, a picture for broad-minded adults, those with broads on their mind. You talk about these people being desperate to see any kind of flesh. This is what they were putting on the posters.
Hey, this is advertisement galore. This is the pinnacle of advertisement. They know what they were selling. Would you almost say our version of that in the 70s was, or even the 60s, was the Carry On films to a degree?
I think so,
in a tamer way.
The sexy shenanigans films.
There's nothing really hardcore in them. They're quite playful.
They're quite tame.
Yeah, you're not going to be that offended.
No, they're not. But these ones are.
It's a buttock and a breast.
It's a back and a breast. Exactly. It's the kind of thing that you look now. You could almost watch these things with your mum and your dad. They're just kind of cheeky wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of things.
You let us know how that goes in the future. I want you to watch Adventures of Lucky Pierre with your parents at some point.
I will do. I say, hey mum, dad, you want to watch this? No, not really. And it's interesting also, he went from that into what HGL would kind of be known for later, these violent, gory movies. AllMovie.com said that Herschell Gordon Lewis, his legacy, he said he probed the depths of disgust and discomfort on screen with more bad taste and imagination than anyone of his era. I think he would have looked at that as a glorious compliment.
Well, I think so. But do you know what they say? This comes from his businessman background. He said himself, look, he found a hole in the market at the time where the tastes of the major studios wouldn't dare go. So finding this space, finding this periphery, he knew, look, we could make money. He's an exploitation filmmaker. So he knows what he can make. He knows how he can turn a profit. And he found these holes what the majors wouldn't take. This enabled him to make profit-driven films that caters to the void that the majors missed. This is very clever. This is very savvy. This is what I'm saying. This is part of that businessman-like approach. He's not an artist. Herschell Gordon Lewis isn't an artist. I don't think any of us can confuse him with an artist.
No.
He's not trying to make the best film here. He's trying to turn a quick profit.
Exactly. And we talk about the customers are obviously there for this. You talk about these voids. The customers are there for this. Anyone who's worked in hospitality will loathe this phrase. I worked in hospitality myself.
Yeah, we all have.
The customer is always right.
Yeah, fuck the customer.
That is very misinterpreted. What that means, everyone thinks, it means the customer is right by default. Nobody is right by default. Yeah. It comes from this idea that the idea that customers drive the market. If there is a demand for this thing over here, you supply that. That's where the money is. These films were obviously in very high demand. Maybe they were kind of lowbrow, they were exploitation, they were looked down on by the mainstream, but there was a market for them. He wouldn't have made the money he did because Adventures of Lucky Pierre, about $7,000. Blood Feast, about $24,000. That made millions. So the market was clearly there.
At the start of this episode, you referenced that for the first time you had watched Blood Feast. Now, what is your kind of in-depth opinion of that? I've seen it many times, and I've got to say, I really enjoy it. Here's the thing with Herschell Gordon Lewis, he's devoid of art. He doesn't have much of his films are pretty much styleless. Mm-hmm. They're very rudimentary. There's technique. They're just, if you or I were given a camera, he would shoot it pretty much the same way an amateur would.
Basically.
So, but there's an aesthetic I like to that. It's a picture and a place of time that is authentic. Mm-hmm. Now, what do you not see? What are you not getting? What do you not like about Blood Feast?
It's not that I necessarily didn't like it. I think it just didn't strike me as being that remarkable. Like you say, everything is rudimentary. Obviously, that's largely a part of its charm. They make you feel like these are the kind of films that you could grab a film camera, grab some friends together, bit of a script. You could make these films in a couple of days. That's the idea. But there are realistic elements to it. You have the the killers being out and about on the prowl, the sacrificing, the kind of silly supernatural elements, but they're woven well into the narrative. I just don't think I enjoyed it as much as something like 2000 Maniacs, though I do have to say I enjoyed it a hell of a lot more than Monster a Go-Go.
Thank fuck for that. I'd be terrified if you didn't.
I had a tooth extracted once. I think that was more fun than watching Monster a Go-Go.
Now, I've got a point by Tim Sullivan to kind of counter what you're saying, or put some nuance to what you're saying. Now, Tim Sullivan is the director of 2001 Maniacs, which was the remake of 2000 Maniacs. I think it was 2004. Now, he makes a good point. He says, look, we watch these now out of context. And now content is easily available, so we can cast a judgment without knowing the context of the time it was made. And his argument is, look, these films look silly. They may not be appreciated because, as I said, you're seeing them out of the context of the time they were made, and you're not seeing the impact that they had on film to come. Like, Blood Feast is the first splatter film. Now, if you take that out of context now, and you're a 20-year-old kid who's seen it for the first time, looks silly, looks goofy, looks cheap, but you're not understanding, without a Blood Feast, there probably and possibly might not have been a Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
That's very, very true. No, I absolutely appreciate that. You can say, I've said this often, it's a film that maybe you don't especially enjoy, but you do appreciate. Right. The silliness, I love the silliness about it. I actually like it as well. The fact that one of the characters, she gets her brain removed, you can see they've just slathered some stuff on the top of her head. Another big problem a lot of these films had, it was very similar with our Britain's own Hammer horror films. The blood never looked very realistic. It looked like candle wax. It's never dark enough in the films.
It's very vibrantly red.
It is, but I think that's the idea because it looks a lot more vibrant. It looks a lot more, if you smother that on a body, it looks a lot more graphic.
I've got to say, Herschell Gordon Lewis does like a lot of colour. They are quite vibrant looking films.
Yeah, they're not dull looking. They're not dull looking films. The outside looks kind of, it's like it's been kind of toned down, especially when it's at night. But scenes inside, there's so much colour, there's so much decoration, there's so much variety going on.
As I said, look, I'm a Herschell Gordon Lewis fan for the most part. When I say that, it's like I like about 6 of his films.
You're not going to defend every single thing he's ever
there's
done.
Films I really like of his, and A Taste of Blood. A Taste of Blood came slightly later in the 60s, and this was his concerted effort to make something that would appeal more to the mainstream. He toned down the blood a little, and he thought if he had done that, it would get into more theaters. It's essentially a Dracula story. Well, it is a Dracula story, but it doesn't really work. I watched it last night, actually, for the first time in a long time. I found it very boring. I did check the time several times. It's really not the greatest film. And I think this is because Herschell Gordon Lewis is stuck in two worlds here. He's trying to appeal to the mainstream fan of sorts, the mainstream horror fan of sorts, Hammer horror crowd, for example. Everything is toned down. But what you're getting is a Herschell Gordon Lewis film without the sensationalism. You're not getting the gorehound aspect. You're not getting the extravagance of the set pieces, and it's very muted, very bland. It doesn't hold up well, even though Gordon Lewis refers to it as his masterpiece. But I think that's only because it was a higher budgeted. The acting's a little more competent, but it's watch it one time and it's quite bland.
So we're talking about a case of where he's tried to please everybody, he's ended up pleasing nobody.
Yes.
He has toned down his vision, and it's just not worked because it's not worked for the people who love him because it almost feels like a betrayal, and it's not working for everyone else because they didn't really like him anyway.
I think so, because 72 was the last of his run of films. He did make a couple more in the 2000s when his name was coming back into fruition. But 1972's The Gore Girls, that's quite good. Now, you'll notice certain tropes. 1972, what's big at 1972? The Giallos are coming in. They're being exported from Europe. Also, The Gore Girls, it has a black-gloved killer. It's nowhere near the competence, of course, as a Giallo, or most Giallo films. It's a good film. It's good. It's a little more sleazier than some of Herschell Gordon Lewis's films. He mixes in his sexploitation-ish because it revolves around a lot of strip clubs, for example. It's good. It's more transgressive. It's maybe more of its time of 72. It's showing how far exploitation cinema was going to go as the 70s progressed. And
as the 70s coming in, we're seeing another subgenre of the exploitation films, big in the grindhouse films, what's called hicksploitation.
Hicksploitation.
This is a genre that's coming in. You talk 1972. We're talking the year of Deliverance, which you could argue is maybe the most acclaimed of the hicksploitation movies.
I think so. Texas Chainsaw as well.
Texas Chainsaw, one of my personal favourites.
We both love them.
Yeah, because the interesting thing with hicksploitation is you think the southern American United States, you think of places like Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, places like this. But it's less important the setting, more important the elements. You think of the hicksploitation films, you think of these notorious backwoods people. You've got these ugly, horrible people living out in the woods, people who know nothing about modern society, ugly, depraved, violent, incestuous elements were often thrown in as well.
The oversexed nymph.
Yes, exactly.
Usually. But depictions of Southern culture has been exploited vastly in mainstream cinema. If you think 1915, Griffith's Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
Now, that was the highest grossing film of the time and essentially is a glorification of the KKK. Now, do you know what esteem that film also holds? It was the first film to be screened at the White House.
Woodrow Wilson screened it.
Now, with President Woodrow remarked, he says, "It's like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it is also terribly true." So you're getting a glorification that it's a great film. I think that's what he means, like it's like writing history with lightning. Unfortunately, its depictions are true.
That's the problem with a film like that, in the fact that it is incredibly historically important how D.W. Griffith pioneered all of these kind of new techniques.
Yeah.
It's just the fact the subject matter, you watch it, the horrible racist stereotypes, the fact it glorifies the Klan, things like this. So it's like you can't actually say, I like Birth of a Nation without having to add a caveat to that. Oh, by the way, I don't agree with its message. Because he did not make Intolerance the year after, which was entirely a response to... Well, the response.
Do you think it was almost a correction to? I think so.
It might as well have been called "Oh, by the way."
Oh, by the way, I'm not really racist. I'm just.
That just happened to be what my film was about.
Yeah.
But those are the characters we're looking at. It's also important that in hicksploitation, it's juxtaposed with the city folk.
Yep.
Deliverance. When I looked at Deliverance, you'll probably agree. For me, it was kind of a metaphor for the civilized and the uncivilized world meeting. You have these big business folk in their flashy cars. They come from the flashy offices. They're from the north, and they come down to these backwoods places.
Yeah.
People just living in sheds, living in squalor and filth.
Absolutely.
Oh, they're so ignorant, they're uneducated, etc., etc. In a way, the Northerners were almost positioned as worse because they were the ones who were horrible to them.
They had the preconceived notions to talk down to somebody. Now, I was watching this video essay on the Arrow Player.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't recall the guy's name. I don't even think the guy's name was stated, who was speaking over this essay, and he made a good point. He was on about the contrast between the Southern culture, or what's represented as the Southern culture. He said, Southerners are vulgar yet gentile, poor yet aristocratic, puritanical yet oversexed. And I think that plays into all this hicksploitation. It's this duality of, Southern hospitality. What is a big saying in this film, and the subversion of that. And I think that's what we're playing with, because in the 50s even, you had Tennessee Williams is A Streetcar Named Desire. That's essentially a Southern hicksploitation of sorts, and that has the oversexed nymph, for example. So we're playing with similar tropes, no matter if it's exploitation, if it's a little more esteemed, for example, like A Streetcar Named Desire. But the depiction of the South has been a catalyst for a lot of American art. You have Southern Gothic writing, you have William Faulkner.
Exactly. So it's not necessarily always done in a bad way. And you mentioned Southern hospitality. It doesn't even have to be America, because I watched a while ago Wolf Creek, which you could argue is the same kind of thing, but you have people from the outback rather than people from the South. Similar thing. People from the city going out, getting stuck out in the middle of nowhere. The hospitality, which is really just a pretense to lure these people in. So it's kind of playing around with that trope.
Would you argue it's supposed to be a culture clash of the civilized city slicker versus the primitiveness of the rural dweller?
Usually what it is.
I think that's what it is this clash of cultures.
So kind of what we did when we talked about Cannibal Holocaust, the similar kind of thing. Who are the civilized people? Who are the real cannibals here?
Exactly. But Wayne, when it comes to 2000 Maniacs,
yes.
Now, I've got to say, I love original trailers. 1964, original trailer. And you know what? As a treat, we're going to play that trailer for you right now.
You're all invited to a centennial celebration. What they were celebrating wasn't important, and it sounded like a heap of fun until 2,000 maniacs, crazed for carnage, started bathing an entire town in pulsing human blood. You'll see 6 young strangers doomed to slaughter by an ancient curse.
came an awful sound.
And from his lips there came an awful sound.
Brutal, evil, ghastly beyond belief. You'll see the most diabolical device ever contrived, designed solely for assassination by a town of madmen, insane with bloodlust.
Stonewall took a gun and he made the Yankees run, but he
2,000 maniacs, gruesomely stained in blood color.
Stonewall said, I'm a-giving you a dying man's request.
I'm a-giving you a dying man's request. Yeah!
Starring Playboy's favorite playmate, Connie Mason.
I love how they have that song in the trailer.
Yeah.
Do you not love that song?
I do. Do you know what else I really love about that trailer as well? How it speaks right to us. Because how often, like, when did they start advertising films on televisions in people's home? Because that was the kind of ad trailer you would see specifically before a film.
Right. I love the narration in that. It reminded me, did you ever see a lot of Hitchcock's first original trailers? And, for example, for Psycho, and he'd just be walking around Bates Hotel and that.
I remember someone commenting, someone's like, he's giving away all the plot points.
No. Look out for this, look out for that.
But I did like, it was, this trailer, it was more like a friend whispering in your ear, like, we should go and see this, look what's happening here, and how it sensationalizes and hypes up. It shows a lot of the movie's key events. It's like bragging about how good it is.
But does it hook you in?
It absolutely does.
I think it hooks you in. It's, in many ways, you wouldn't see a trailer like that now. Trailers now are just highlights of the best bits of a film.
Yeah.
Where this is like, it's almost like somebody's inviting you to come watch it.
It's more like the highlights of who's in the film.
Exactly.
It's being sold on that. This is being sold on its gore, on its exploitation value. That trailer, it's under no delusions about what the film actually is, and the fact it just completely runs with it.
Right, the story is so simple, Wade. We have 6 city slickers. We have six outsiders. We are in Pleasant Valley.
It's based in the South, but it's filmed in Florida. Because what's weird is, Florida and Texas, if you mention the Deep South, Florida and Texas aren't always counted as Deep South. They're considered peripheral states in the Deep South. Okay. But this was filmed in Florida, and apparently pretty much the entire town took part in the filming of it.
As extras. I love those little lines.
So did I, because I enjoyed, I don't know about you, I like watching films with extras. I like watching the extras. Because someone was saying, you watch this film, you look at some of the extras, a lot of them don't quite know what's going on. No. You have these sacrifice scenes where someone's being murdered or mutilated, and there's people looking around like, what are we doing here? What's happening right now?
But the story, Wade, 6 outsiders, they come to this town of Pleasant Valley. Now, they are diverted by Rufus and his gang.
Yes.
Rufus the doofus, I like to call him.
Who do make very realistic detour signs.
Now, Rufus is rumoured to be one of the actual townspeople of St. Cloud, Florida.
Right.
I hope that's true. He never had another acting credit.
No.
I really hope that's true.
Yeah, but man, how does he throw himself into this part?
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Is he jacked to the gills on something?
Yeah, I would argue most of the actors in this really throw themselves in, especially the people from the town. We talk Southern hospitality. Man, they've got it coming out of their ears.
Right, so Southern hospitality, that's their veneer to keep them in this town. They're celebrating their centennial anniversary. Okay. Where do we go from there, Wayne? Do you stay when you're one of these guys?
Well, you mean they're offering there's a barbecue and a party on, and we're special guests, so yeah.
Special guests, barbecues. When did that ever go wrong in the South?
That's the thing. It's the aggressive hospitality. Oh, you're here. Why you're not going to leave? It's guilt. It's making you feel bad for like you wanting to stay.
And you know that song in the trailer I was referring to? What?
Yeah.
No, the Pleasant Valley Boys. That's the name of the band in this film. Mm-hmm. Confession.
Yeah.
I actually like the music of this film.
I like the music of this
film.
The
bluegrass.
Yeah, because it's that kind of music you would hear in that time. And I do like how the musicians just kind of pop up now and then and just play the song to people.
No, the main song in this is Rebel Yell, The South's Gonna Rise Again. That's a great song. Mm-hmm. But do you know who wrote that? Well, Herschell Gordon Lewis.
He actually wrote the song himself.
He wrote the song for the film.
Well, I'm not surprised because I imagine he would be very, very hands-on. The budget for the film was $65,000, which was a lot more than he'd worked with before. I like how he said it led to a more polished product.
Oh, yeah, well, it's in the eye of the beholder.
Exactly. I'm not sure exactly what you're defining as a polished product, but that's the basic premise. After being fooled by these guys to come into this town, everything about the film kind of silly, even how they lure them in. They put out this detour sign they've written.
Yes.
I said, they missed a trick. They spelt detour correctly. I think it would have been funnier if they'd spelled it wrong.
Why? To play in the stereotype that they're thick?
Exactly, the stereotype, and how do these people, despite them being the city folk, where the smart people, they still fall for it, even though it's an incorrect sign, clearly.
Well, they've had a couple hundred years to think of that way.
They did. Very deliberate, the fact this is a 1965 film, because we're talking exactly 100 years since the ending of the Civil War, which is pivotal to the plot of this film.
It is, Wade. But you know how you were saying about we loved how the extras in the film, the participants in this film, are from the actual town of St. Cloud, Florida. Mm-hmm. I like the verisimilitude that adds to it. There's an authenticity. Now, I had a problem with... Did you ever see Rob Zombie's The Devil's Rejects?
No, I didn't.
No, I really liked that film. But my issue with it, the part of that film revolves around the Firefly family. And one of the characters, Baby Firefly, played by Sherry Moon Zombie, right? They're these rednecks, they live on the road, they're kind of, alcoholic, drug-addled murderers. Mm-hmm. Okay. They look grimy, they look gritty. She has perfect white teeth.
Yeah, that's
and
a trick
I was like,
missed.
what? That wouldn't happen.
It's the same when you watch movies that are set 500 years ago. You see people have perfect pearly whites. And which dentist are these people going to?
Could they not have quickly sprayed them a bit yellow?
Exactly, just put some gunk on the teeth. It can't be that difficult.
But that's what I was saying. For this film, because it feels authentic, they actually feel like the characters within the film. It brings that verisimilitude to it. And I really like that, how they've embraced bringing all these extras. Now, I'm assuming they brought them because they didn't have to pay them.
Probably, yeah.
So I think that played a big part of it.
Just pay them in human meat.
But did you like that? It looked authentic.
It did. It didn't feel like a lot of the actors were acting as other people. It felt like exaggerated versions of their own personalities. You can imagine going to towns like this. Everybody wants to welcome you in. If you're an outsider, we want to show you a good time. We want you to have fun. So it does feel like it's just how they usually are, but amped up.
Now, we're saying the centenary of this town. Mm-hmm. Why is that important to this film?
It's because 100 years ago, that's where the Civil War ended, of course, and it's a celebration of the war coming to an end. But kind of not. There's a very interesting twist. I like this. At one point, two characters see a plaque which marked that 100 years ago, near the end of the Civil War, a group of Union soldiers came in and essentially slaughtered the town.
Right.
I found that really depressing because that's the kind of thing that would easily happen in warfare. It doesn't seem unrealistic that. It seems like in war, where things are complicated, things are confused, things like that could happen and they could just slip away. Right. The movie Platoon, for example, where the soldiers go in and they destroy that little town.
The barbarity of war.
Exactly. I've been to Vietnam. I've been to the Vietnam War Museum. There's lots of accounts of this where these soldiers came in, American soldiers, and just slaughtered these towns, and there was no accountability for it.
Now, do you think it adds an extra layer of nuance beyond the stereotype? The gist of this film, what drives the film, what is the initiating barbarity in certain aspects, is the barbarity of the Union soldiers against the Confederacy or the southern town.
Exactly, that's what Platoon did. It showed that the American soldiers could be the baddies. It didn't just paint it as a black and white, us versus them kind of thing. And at one point, when they're reading the plaque, I like this, one line of dialogue mentions a centennial of blood vengeance. Wouldn't that have been a great alternate title for this film?
Centennial of Blood Vengeance. Would that be similar to the alternative title in Big Trouble in Little China, where it's very on the nose?
Exactly, it is very on the nose. I like the taglines as well. We were talking posters before. This has some great taglines. One of them is brutal, ... evil, ... ghastly beyond belief. This one's much better, though. It says, the most diabolical device ever contrived, designed solely for carnage by a town of madmen, crazed with bloodlust, because that's last bits in capitals.
This film was definitely made by two men in the advertisement business.
It absolutely was.
I love that.
I love how the film sells itself.
Exactly. It is. That's what it's all about, salesmanship. As we said, this isn't a technical film. It's not an acting film. Let's be honest.
No, it's not.
It's selling you something. It's selling you shock. It's selling you horror. It's selling you murder. It knows what the objective of it is. It is pure, out-and-out exploitation cinema.
As weird as this sounds, the acting in this film is not good, but I like the acting in this film.
Now, we've explained the gist of the story, because there's not much story. That is pretty much the gist of the story. Now, how does what we were referring to earlier in this film, hicksploitation, relate to this film? And I was thinking, okay, you've mentioned that plaque, the past grievances. Now, could you say one of the themes in this film, Wayne, is you can't bury the past. Its trauma will always resurface.
I was thinking the sins of the past.
Yes.
The sins of the past being visited on the present. Because what adds kind of an extra layer to this film is the Southerners aren't doing this to the Northerners just because they don't like the North.
No.
It's not just a, you're not like us, you're not one of us. No, it's rooted in their history.
It's a tit for tat. You done this to me, I'm going to do this to you.
Exactly. And like I say, it feels like something that could have occurred in real warfare. And also, another idea I had is it kind of deals with the fate of a losing side of the war, because if you're in a war like the Civil War, dragged on for years, you're on the losing side. What happens to you then?
Right.
It's like this whole idea of what happened to Germany and Austria after the World War II was lost. What happens then? You have a broken nation. These are a broken people.
Well, how do you reconfigure your sense of identity when you're told in the history books that you were the bad guy? Where do you go from that? How do you reconcile that you were maybe the bad one in history?
Exactly.
Interesting point.
And what you tried to say to the Northerners, your ancestors, you essentially destroyed our town, you murdered our people for no good reason. Why should we welcome you with open arms?
It's very complicated way.
When you think about it, there is a lot more to this film. I know a lot of folk will just look at it and think of mindless exploitation, but when you throw themes like this in, generally, even a simple one person versus one, or one group versus one, you can look a lot deeper into it. And I think a lot of these themes are in this film.
Now, why is this coming to relevance? Now, as we said, these past traumas, these past sins, they resurface. Ideas maybe don't die. They just reappear in a different form. Now, in America itself at the moment, or the world itself, certain ideas are coming back into favor. We're going back into racial politics, for example. So what we thought were things of the past are resurfacing. They don't die. And I think this use of the stereotype, okay? I don't think Herschell Gordon Lewis, for example, was thinking too deeply on this topic. I think his character of the South was purposeful and pointed. I don't think there was anything deeper than that, other than these are the bad guys, be wary of them.
And also because the film has a kind of an upbeat comedic tone. We talk with the soundtrack, you have these guys going around playing bluegrass. A lot of the music is very upbeat. Even the acts of revenge that are carried out by the townsfolk, they're presented more like entertainment than blood vengeance.
Well, that's what there's a gleeful tone. It's not even a morbid film, I wouldn't say. And the soundtrack itself is it's upbeat bluegrass. What kind of weaves its way around the murders almost as a narrative as itself. But a point I was making about, in society, in American society, how, in the South, it's still, for example, within elite stature, acceptable to trash the poor rural South. Have you ever noticed?
Yeah.
Jim Goad, infamous and notorious author in the 1990s, he wrote this book called The Redneck Manifesto, how hillbillies, hicks, and white trash became America's scapegoats. And I was thinking of how that is quite true. You can depict, you're not allowed, Wayne, and this is devil's advocate, you're not allowed to depict any other minority, for example, in a scathing light, in an acceptable manner, yet you can trash, you can sully anything to do with the poor rural South, and it's acceptable by the mainstream.
And they become, and like you say, it becomes a scapegoat for all the ills.
Exactly.
It's those people that shake the fist, them damn such and such. It's like putting all of the blame on this group of people, even though they've maybe not necessarily done anything. They become acceptable targets.
Now, I've got to say, I am not a reader of Jim Goad. I know he's highly controversial, though he is friends with Patton Oswalt and Margaret Cho, so he has liberal friends too, but he's become somewhat of an alt-right figure.
Right, but those were the kind of books he wrote
about.
Well,
he started a zine in the 90s, I think, with his then wife or partner, called Answer Me, which was read by Kurt Cobain. It was a highly influential alternative zine. So he has alternative credentials. He's still alternative now, even though his politics are heading towards the right, let's say.
Maybe. Well, it feels like the townsfolk, especially the mayor, beautifully played, by the way, mad dude, he wasn't even from the South, but he did such a good Southern accent, Gordon Lewis actually used him in a lot of films afterwards.
Mayor Buckman.
That's the guy.
Now, he was played by an actor called Tolkius Blanc, who is credited as Jeffrey Allen. Now, he went by the name Jeffrey Allen because he was never a member of the Screen Actors Guild. Now, he could easily have made... Now, when you were a child, Wayne, on reruns, did you ever watch The Dukes of Hazzard?
Yes.
I loved that TV show so much. He would have been a great Boss Hogg.
He would have been a good Boss Hogg.
Terrific Boss Hogg. I used to love this. I loved so much The Dukes of Hazzard.
Because of how comically kind of over the top it was.
Yeah, I just wanted to tour about in a Dodge Charger and dirt roads.
I used to hum the theme tune all the time.
The Dixie tune.
Yeah, just a good old boys. I used to hum that all the time. But with
Waylon Jennings.
Yeah, this mayor, his exaggerated manner, his exaggerated way of talking, it does make sense these people would be bought in
Southern
by
hospitality.
He very much lures them in.
Yep.
And even in scenes where these townsfolk are luring these, we'll say, northerners off to their death, even then it's done funny. Oh, just come with us. We've got something to show you. You're the special guest. You're going to love this, etc., etc.
Well, they are the special guest, right? They are there for a purpose.
At the barbecue.
At the barbecue, the boulder, the barrel, the what else? The horse.
I know these things sound all strange, but yeah, these are literally things that happen in this film. It does have some very creative kills, you have to say.
Now, I've got to say, in Herschell Gordon Lewis films, he uses a staple of actors. We just mentioned Jeffrey Allen as Mayor Buckman, but there's also William Kerwin, who is credited in this film as Thomas Wood. Now, I know you referenced, and I don't know if you were certain why he's credited as Thomas Wood.
No, I'm not exactly sure.
Right,
why.
well, he was a member of the Screen Actors Guild, so he couldn't use that name, William Kerwin, because that was his registered Screen Actors Guild name. And this film is non-unionized. It's an independent film. They're not using a union crew, so therefore he would have been breaking the union code. So he had to work under Thomas Wood.
I did like how it meant his name that he's credited under is closer to his character's name than to his actual real name, because he plays Tom White. Thomas Wood is closer to Tom White than it is to William Kerwin.
But William Kerwin, I think, I'm on about in the world of Herschell Gordon Lewis. He's a very competent, a very good actor. Within a film where acting isn't reigning supreme, I think William Kerwin is a solid staple actor who elevates the films he's in. He was in Blood Feast. He was in this. He was in A Taste of Blood, which Color Me Blood Red. I'm not sure if he was in Color Me Blood Red, but a great film he was in. And you know how we mentioned earlier the Nudie Cutie?
Yeah.
Well, the inventor, Herschell Gordon Lewis, also created the Roughie. Now, these were rough versions of the Nudie Cutie, where they would take nude aspects, like a Nudie Cutie, but put them in a crime setting.
Okay.
And one of his films, Scum of the Earth, that's a really damn good film. It's filmed in black and white, stars William Kerwin. Very great film.
Do you think Roughies could, in a way, be kind of the precursor to the rape revenge flicks?
Could be.
Did it feel like it was going that way?
I think Scum of the Earth, I'm sure, it's been a while since I watched it, the plot is essentially, they are these photographers, played by William Kerwin, etc., and they pick glamour shots of girls, usually.
Yeah.
But some of them take to bribing the women to pose in sexualized scenes to further... to sell them on the black market to high school kids and stuff.
Okay. Well, William Kerwin does feel to me like a very kind of believably discerning...
He's quite an accomplished guy.
He is, yeah. Like the way he talks in the films, the way he acts, it's like he's the guy that's always working things out. He does it in Blood Feast. He does it in this as well. I think he's a very good actor. I'm not saying he's great. Nobody in this film is, I'd say, great acting.
Hey, shut up. I would say William Kerwin is great. But William Kerwin actually met Herschell Gordon Lewis when Herschell Gordon Lewis was doing his commercial short films for the companies. Now, here's an interesting little point, right?
Yeah.
The first feature he was in of Herschell Gordon Lewis, William Kerwin, was Living Venus. Now, Living Venus was a fictional take of the story of Playboy and Hugh Hefner. Now, that plays in because one of the leading actresses in this film is Playmate Connie Mason. Now, Connie Mason was a Playboy bunny and Playmate of the Month for its June 1963 issue. But what also connects that, as I said, William Kerwin was in Herschell Gordon Lewis's Living Venus. Connie Mason was a staple of Herschell Gordon Lewis films. And in real life, at the time of this film, William Kerwin, Connie Mason were married.
They're actually married in real life.
They were the couple at the end who get away.
Which is interesting because in this one, they're the only couple who aren't actually married in this film.
I know.
And the film does kind of make a point of that.
She picks him up as a hitchhiker.
And if
she's a very trusting driver to pick him up.
Thing is, because the townspeople constantly forget that, or they just don't know that because they keep referring to him as if he is her husband.
I know.
Even though she's not, and she never says at any point, oh, this is your fella, etc. Never mentioned. And if you go to actually IMDb, since we're talking about the actors, there's always like a screenshot of them. Most of the people who were in this film, their screenshot is just from this film. Like you say, the actor who played Rufus, he's mostly known from this film.
I still hope it's true that he's a townsperson.
I would like that as well. And if you look through a lot of their filmography, some of the big players in this film, it was this kind of movies they mostly stuck to. We talk about someone like Coppola, who went to do bigger things, but a lot of these people, they did kind of make their mark in this genre, and they kind of stuck to that. Maybe that's where they felt like the safest.
Did we mention Billy?
Oh, we didn't mention Billy.
Little Billy?
Damn it, Billy.
The cat hanger?
Put that noose down, Billy.
Do you know on my notes, all I've got for Billy is all-around rabble-rouser and cat killer.
That kind of sums it up. It brings me back to a point, actually. On the poster, there's quite a very...
noose?
There's a gallows on it, like an actual gallows thing set up. No one's actually hanged in the movie, unless you count the cat.
The cat is hanged, Wayne.
But even then, it's kind of a flash, isn't it?
Do you have a problem? I know your wife has a problem with animal on-screen death. Not real animal on-screen death.
Well, we have spoken before when it's used in some like cannibal holocaust, which shouldn't have happened at all. But here, to be fair, you don't see anything.
That's off-screen.
It's implied.
Is it too much like your cat, Wayne? Were you thinking of little Luna being hung by little Billy?
Oh, she just scratched their eyes out already. Actually, Billy did bring about the biggest laugh. I've already told you it's the biggest laugh in the film, where it's a scene where they have to trying to drive out of this town. Billy goes with them. They dump Billy. I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah, well, they go to the auto garage. Yeah. They make their escape. Billy's in the car. He has to help them get out for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. When they get out of town, they dump him. Mm-hmm. Kudos to them.
Exactly. He just dumped him by the side of the road because they've been lying to Billy the whole time, saying there's candy in the trunk, etc.
He made himself sound like a groomer. Oh, we'll promise you sweets.
Exactly. He's been pretty annoying, Billy, the entire time, Billy. But it's funny seeing him getting dumped. Not really many child actors in this film. It's mostly elderly townsfolk.
Just little Billy.
Mm. I did notice a lot throughout this film as well. You probably noticed this as well. We're talking about kind of cheapness of the production. There's a lot of little problems in this film. Things like, I noticed there's lots of awkward jump cuts. You have flashed frames. There's bad sound. There's quite a lot of bad dubbing. The primitiveness actually kind of works because these are supposed to be people from 100 years ago.
I think so. I always think if you gloss exploitation too much, it loses its appeal. It's supposed to look dirty and grimy. I think if you try to put a veneer of respectability, should we say, it kind of loses its edge. I like that it's got that edge. I like how did you see the Arrow video restoration? Was that the restoration you've seen by any chance?
I don't think so. I think it was quite a high quality copy for what it was, but it still felt it did have that kind of dirty griminess.
Right. Well, on the Arrow video restoration, because the film itself, the actual film stock, parts had deteriorated through time, they could only restore so much, and some they had to have the crackles and the pops and that in it. So I quite liked that.
Well, some filmmakers use it deliberately. When we talked about Planet Terror, Robert Rodriguez, that had lots of pops, that had kind of bangs on the soundtrack, there was cigarette burns, there was scenes where it looked like the film was coming apart, deteriorating. That was put in deliberately to ape the grindhouse films of the time.
Tarantino done it better in Death Proof, because Tarantino, all them tropes you're saying, he actually physically scratched the film, whereas Planet Terror, I believe, was filmed digitally. I can't be certain, but I'm sure it was digitally done.
It looked like it might have been digitally,
whereas on Death Proof, the actual film stock itself was deteriorated. It was scratched. It was burnt.
So it works. Sometimes restorations work, sometimes they don't. Another film we talk about endlessly, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, one of its appeals, one of the reasons it's so effective is because it looks bad. If you were to put a glossy veneer, a glossy sheen, it would lose a lot of that. You said about how Gordon Lewis was trying to tone things down
for Taste of Blood.
And it didn't work at all, because you're trying to appeal to everybody.
It looked like a bad Hammer horror film.
Exactly. You're not targeting your audience. You're just glossing over a product that should not have that done to it.
Now, Wayne... Blood Feast, 2000 Maniacs, Wizard of Gore, the Gore Girls, all splatter films. Now, a splatter film, like a slasher film, they live and die by their kills.
Literally.
Yeah, literally. Pun definitely intended.
yeah. Sorry, I had to throw that in. I apologise. Carry on.
Do you know, in my notes, I actually said, this is a splatter film by definition. So it lives and dies, pun very intended, by its kills.
I managed to make your pun for you.
You punned me.
You just got punned. But the kills we're talking about, very creative, very interesting, very well done kills. I kind of like that some of them look a bit silly, because we're talking things like severances, people losing limbs, people losing fingers, people being crushed by things. But the way it's done, because the trailer we were talking about before, that absolutely relished those kind of things.
We have a girl butcher. She's on a butcher table. She takes an axe to the arm. She dies quite quick. Would you not take a while to bleed after that?
I said that. I do like how she gets her arm cut off.
She does like about one scream and then
she does that. I think people say, why is it a lot of time it's women who are victimized in this movies? I think it's the screaming, because you imagine the soundtrack or a horror film, you imagine those ear-piercing screams.
Well, I think Brian De Palma was once asked, look, what's with this? Is this a misogynistic thing? Are you killing women in a gleeful way? It's like, no, we identify. Nobody's scared for a man. You're terrified for the woman. Now, that maybe is a bit outdated.
I know, but no, even Blood Feast did the same thing, because it was at the very start, they say, okay, another woman's been killed, all women stay inside. So it's clearly expressing a concern for their
I think
well-being.
It's inherent, you want to protect a woman, a man, you can be like, fuck off.
But to be fair, half the people killed in this movie are men. It's because it's two couples that get killed off.
So we also have a guy whose each limb of his is tied to a horse.
Oh man,
4 different horses.
That one made me cringe, because again, that is an actual historical punishment.
Now, I've got to say, were you slightly disappointed by this? I was hoping they veered into complete gruesomeness, but the horses, when they run off, all what is seen of that murder, of that decapitation, of that delimbing, Wayne, is a horse dragging a shitty-looking limb across the ground.
I looked at that and thought, what happened to the rest of his body? Did the rest of him vanish?
Maybe.
The horses have just run off with the rest of his body.
He buggered off back in time with the rest.
But I tell you a kill that is not in any way disappointing, the barrel kill.
That is the greatest kill of this film.
How this dude was ever lured into this.
Explain it to them.
What's happening is they're going to have play a little game. This is an event. It's all part of the Centennial, as the pretense goes, where one of the characters, he has to crawl through a barrel. Immediate red flags right there.
Yep.
But they get him into the barrel and they stick him in, and the mayor knocks nails into the barrel right around it and then pushes it down a hill. Man, that is a gruesome death.
Who does this guy think he is? Johnny Knoxville?
I have to say, I don't think I've ever seen death by nail barrel.
That is a really great scene. That is a really great idea. It's very simple.
Yeah.
It doesn't take much. Very simple idea. Nail and barrel. Ha ha ha. Very effective. Very gruesome. You can actually feel the pain. Feel the pain.
And it's handled very well. Like the kind of build up to it where he's been held in while they're knocking the nails, and you really get to feel for the guy. And at the end, when you see all the nails covered in blood at the bottom, and you think how horrible a death that would be, because the first woman, she dies, like you say, kind of unrealistically quick. This would have taken quite a while, and this would have been horrible, rolling all the way down that hill, all those nails piercing your body.
What did you think about the kill? I thought this was quite good. Now, the idea was good, the conception was good. We have a girl lying on a board. Above her is a massive several-ton boulder. Beside her, beside the boulder, is a target. Now we have Rufus the Doofus with a rock in hand, throwing at that target. When he hits the target, or if he hits the target, that boulder will fall and squash her to death. That's quite a good idea. Did you like how they turned all these ideas, all these killings, into essentially a game?
Exactly. Like I said earlier, it's not so much about vengeance, it's been done more like for entertainment. Because it's anyone who's familiar with game shows, especially American game shows, will recognize that setup like a dunk tank. So you hit a target and the person is dropped into the water. But here, it's a boulder that's dropped on them. And it's a kind of sick entertainment. These people take a kind of gleeful pleasure in this. Not just the kill, but the build-up to the kill. Because the people are throwing rocks trying to hit this target for the rock to fall, and they keep missing. That's just building up the anticipation, because if you're the woman lying on the rock, you think every throw that's going to be the end of it, but it's not, because they keep missing. So they do really build up to it. And the kill itself, you don't see a lot. You do see the aftermath though. Gory as hell, of course.
I like the gore for its time. If people hadn't seen these films and you're talking about splatter, you're talking about the gore, do you think a modern gore hound who had not gone back to the 60s would think that looks so tame?
No, I think the problem is nowadays we're expecting more realism in it. We're not expecting it to be as exaggerated in this. Nowadays, when we have the Human Centipede films, you've got the Saw films, you've got the Hostel films. You're kind of desensitized to this kind of thing, how it's made to look more realistic, made to look more believable. Here, it's still somewhat realistic, but there's still an entertainment aspect to it, a kind of amped up aspect to it, which makes it kind of more disturbing in a way, the fact it's all just part of this sick game.
Now, do you believe Herschell Gordon Lewis when he says this, or do you think he's just rewriting history to his own specifications? He said, this is talking in hindsight, that he never wanted his films, the kills in his films, to look real. He didn't want it to dwell on real-life murder. He always wanted it to look theatrical and a slight facade to it, a falsity to it. I don't know if that's what he's going for.
Well, I can see where he's coming from. Some of the kills don't look very real. When someone has an arm chopped off, it's obviously the arm's tucked in. A character has a thumb chopped off, obviously she's tucked the thumb in. When you see the rock lying on them, obviously it's off to the side, things like this. So, yeah, they are did in a kind of exaggerated way.
He said he would never make a film where the killings look realistic. I don't believe him there. I think he's saying that is a rewriting of history. I may be wrong, but when you're pulling animal innards from a human, you're going for something gruesome.
Something dark. Do you think, was this a response to criticism that he was receiving?
Maybe. But he said this is an old man, I should say. As
yes.
an older gentleman.
Well, the interview I watched with HGL was from 2006, 10 years before he died. And he lived to be in his 90s, I think.
He was 90.
In his 90s, yeah. So, obviously, at this point, he is looking back on his career. He is looking at the impact he has made. Maybe he feels different about it then, because back then, he was a young man making films in an emerging market. So, maybe it felt different to him then. There's all sorts of things, if you went back, he would do differently. But this is just his perspective at the time when he was not necessarily being acknowledged by mainstream Hollywood, but he was kind of acknowledging it and the role it played.
Well, he did leave after the Gore Girls in 1972. He did leave the industry, and part of this was because he said, look, my films now are becoming a parody of themselves. And not only that, it was 1972, the mainstream Hollywood film had caught up now. They could do it more realistic, they could do it with a bigger budget, they can essentially do what he's doing, but on a better scale. And I think he knew his time had come because, as we were saying, he was looking for holes in the market where he could make money. But now Hollywood was catering to that market. Because, I mean, I know it's not a gore film, but around this time, even maybe a couple of years before, you had the first X-rated film in mainstream cinema. You had Midnight Cowboy. So Hollywood was cottoning on to the counterculture. They were cottoning on to the alternative scene. And they were appropriating that for their own financial gain. And I think this put a lot of filmmakers maybe out of business who had a little niche going.
I think so, because it wasn't shocking, it wasn't taboo anymore. Yesterday it was taboo, and then tomorrow it's just commonplace. It's how culture works, isn't it? It's how our society works. Something comes along, it's shocking, or maybe it's fantastic. The hell is exploited out of it, and eventually it just gets kind of dull. Like CGI was like that, when it first came in films, it was revolutionary, it was fantastic, but now it's just so commonplace to see it. It's got to a point now we don't like seeing it. We want to go back to practical effects.
Because it's tactile, it's realistic. It feels human-made. It's not computerized. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, because this is a nice little story. It didn't last long in Herschell Gordon Lewis's life, his period, his horrorness, let's say. In the late 60s, he had his friend, I think it was Chicago, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was Chicago, in the late 60s, who had this abandoned building. And he said to Herschell Gordon Lewis, he said, look, do you have any idea what you would like to do with this building? Would you like to take over this building, rent this building, for example? And he did. He created a cinema where it would play these types of films, predominantly his own, and it would be a live theatre. Now, this live theatre would be influenced by the Grand Guignol of Paris, live on stage butchery, for example. Now, this place, appropriately, and I like this name, was called The Bloodshed.
That's a much better pun than I made before.
That's a good title, though.
That's a good one, yeah.
Now, it didn't last long. I think it only lasted possibly a year or two. But these common performances would be, an actor would come out onto the stage, he would address the audience in the stage, somebody would come up behind him, slit his throat, the guy would bleed to death on stage. Now, that was pretty much it.
That was it?
There wasn't anything grand. I imagine they were using relatively low budgets. They were essentially doing the silly little tricks they were using within the films that Herschell Gordon Lewis made. But I think that's a nice little anecdote. I mean, you had The Bloodshed. That's a good name. You had this point when he had his own building. He was showing his own films. He had a little theatre going. Now, in film in general, and on Herschell Gordon Lewis's films in general, somebody once asked him, look, Herschell, what is your inspiration for this? He says, oh, it's just wild imagination. We had no artistic master, maybe the Grand Guignol in Paris. The notion was simply something that we felt might outrage without being obscene. So I think there's a playfulness, there's a silliness, it's in on the joke. It knows there's goofy effects. It knows there's goofiness to it.
Yeah, and when I think of the films that I've seen of his recently, 2000 Maniacs and Blood Feast, Blood Feast more than 2000 Maniacs, they did have that performance feel to them, like they were performing to a small group of people, to the point that in the build-up to some of the kills, there's actually a drum roll that can be heard. So it's like it's being performed.
It's performative.
It is performative.
It's theatre.
A lot of it is like stage where, say you had a play and you were, the act of murdering someone, the actors would stand in such a way that you had full view of the victim, because you couldn't have the victim blocked, for example.
These are worlds away from Hostel or Saw.
Yes,
and
they're
I
very
don't
different.
think it's trying to aspire to be like that. I think Saw, Hostel, I think if you asked, for example, Eli Roth, he'd be very influenced by Herschell Gordon Lewis. But things have a trajectory. You can't stay that goofiness forever.
No.
Things transgress. They transform into something else. And Herschell Gordon Lewis, look, he's a trailblazer. He is the godfather of gore. He's made a terrific film in 2000 Maniacs. Rightfully, he names it his greatest film. And I think it is. I've saw a few more than you. I've not saw them all. But for me, from my limited capacity, I think I've saw 6, 7, for example. To me, it's his greatest film. It's him distilled. It's him with the most to say. It's him with a slightly bigger budget. It's him with a proper 3-act structure. It's him in a nutshell.
So that was our take on the great Herschell Gordon Lewis and the blood-soaked masterpiece that is 2000 Maniacs. But for now, I'm Wayne.
I'm Liam.
Join us next time when we'll discuss, dissect and deep dive all things film, from the obscure to the mainstream.